Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. I am Joel Chasnoff, coming to you tonight from New York City on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where the Jews used to really live. Now there's still Jews here, not quite as many as before, but still a pretty Jewish neighborhood. Psyched to be here in New York, and I'll get to why in a little bit. I am in the city. Today is March 27th, 2024, and today's broadcast is called Sorry I Was Kidnapped. We're going to share three stories relating to the hostages or the idea of being a hostage. And then, of course, get to all the news, which there was a lot of this week, and also your questions, which sort of a record as well. A record number of questions came in this week, which I'm really pleased to see that you're so interested and see this as a place where you can get your questions answered. So, as I said, the title is Sorry I Was Kidnapped. And this is actually a direct quote from one of the hostages who is now out of Gaza. Actually, not just one hostage, there was one, but then several others jumped on to their own social media feeds and put up as their status, Sorry I Was Kidnapped. And it's responding to none other than the wife of the prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. His wife is Sarah Netanyahu. And apparently, over the past week, since the last time you and I met, Sarah Netanyahu, the wife of the prime minister, was very upset and spoke to a member of the opposition, not a Likud member. She spoke to a member of the opposition of the government, and she said, I can't believe these hostages don't appreciate that we got them out. They never even got in touch with me and Bibi, Benjamin, to thank us. So basically, she was complaining that hostages who had been in Gaza and that had been freed as part of this first truce with Hamas had never reached out to her and her husband, the prime minister, to thank them for securing their freedom. And then she came out through a spokesman saying this actually wasn't true, that she had said something else and that it was all made up. But it really doesn't matter. And the reason I'm sharing this story with you is that I think it really very much conveys how the public feels about the Netanyahus in general. A lot of times when you guys email me with your questions, many of the questions have to do with what do Israelis think of Netanyahu? Do they want new elections? And this story is very emblematic of the public sentiment toward the Netanyahus right now. And in a way, it doesn't matter if it was factual, it's still true. What does that mean? That even if she literally didn't say those words, saying that these hostages never reached out to thank her and her husband, it's still very much in line with the general attitude they seem to be having toward the hostages, which is many Israelis now feel that the Netanyahus see the hostages as just pawns in their own political survival, that they care first and foremost about staying in power, and second, about winning the war, and third, about bringing home the hostages. So whether or not she actually said these words verbatim is less true. What matters is that this is a way to answer your question about how Israelis feel. And Israelis are getting more and more upset with Bibi, with Netanyahu, and his approval ratings are going ever more down. Latest polls show his ruling coalition being far below what they would need to stay in power. You need 61, that's a majority. That's 50% plus one. There's 120 in the Knesset. You would need 61 to be in power, and he would not get that according to the latest polls. It shows that Benny Gantz and his new coalition, were it to form, would have 74 seats, which is 13 more than a majority, and Bibi would not be a part of the next government, would not be the prime minister. So the reason I wanted to start with that story is I think it very much shows what Israelis are feeling right now. And the news of the past week has exacerbated that even the more so, and we'll get to that. And I mentioned that other hostages sort of added on after this first hostage, who's a teenager from the nearby town that I live in. I live in Ra'anana, and he's from Hod HaSharon. The first one was a teenager from Hod HaSharon who tweeted, "Sorry, I was kidnapped." and joining in with a 13-year-old boy who put his on his Instagram as his feed. He said, "Sorry, I was kidnapped. Next time I'll fund my own vacation in Gaza." This is from a 13-year-old boy responding, and his brother had been kidnapped with him. They were both released, but their father was killed, and his body is still being held in Gaza. So it just sort of reflects the overall lack of sensitivity that many people feel the Netanyahus have showed toward the Israeli public in general and toward the hostages in particular. And you might be wondering, why did I say the Netanyahus? They're very much seen as a couple. There are even those who believe that Sarah Netanyahu is the one who pulls the strings. There's a popular Israeli joke that's been around for years about Benjamin and Sarah Netanyahu sitting in a cafe, and a waiter takes their order in the cafe, and then the waiter walks away, and Benjamin, Bibi Netanyahu, turns to Sarah and says, "You see what happened? If you had married him, you would have been married to a waiter." And she says, "No, if I'd been married to him, he would have been prime minister." That's how a lot of people feel about Sarah Netanyahu, and that's why I refer to them as the Netanyahus. The same way a lot of people who've always been against the Clintons refer to them as the Clintons, Hillary and Bill, as this sort of couple who work together. That's sort of the a lot of the sentiment in Israel that Sarah and Bibi are a team. So that was the first story. The second story about Sorry I Was Kidnapped has to do with the hostages who have come back and what we're learning about them. Over the past 48 hours, there was a young female hostage who really, for the first time, stated out loud that she was forced at gunpoint to, what she said, perform sexual acts on members of Hamas. And she didn't go into more detail than that. But with all the outrage in Israel that the world is not paying attention to the sexual abuse of Israeli women, this was really one of the first times that one of the women who was captive came out and actually stated, yes, under threat of gunpoint, I myself had to perform sexual acts. Now, in the past, what it's been is other female hostages saying that they had witnessed fellow female hostages being forced to do things and saying that this is probably still happening now. But this was really the first case of a female hostage herself. I believe she's 22 or younger. She's one of the young ones who said that she had to do this. And I think Israelis, in a way, are hoping that the world will see, and this might change world opinion, specifically the United Nations response. But there's also not a lot of hope. I think the evidence has been presented, and we're sort of at a point where we feel, what more do we need to present? What more do we need to say for the United Nations to take a stand against Hamas, against the sexual crimes, the way that they're against Israel when we do even the smallest things, would take prisoners who are Hamas members, but strip them down to their underwear. The United Nations has made a big deal of that. But the reason we strip them down to their underwear, these are male prisoners who are suspected of being part of Hamas, is because they've often worn suicide bombs and other ammunition below their clothing. And that is why we strip them down. And the United Nations has always come out against that. And there are protests about not being humanitarian in our treatment. We just want the world to treat us as fairly as they do everyone else. So that is the second story. And one other angle of this is that more and more hostages who have been released are saying that they were held by private families. And, they're not being held by Hamas terrorists. They're not being held by Islamic Jihad. They're actually just held by regular families with children in Gaza. And this is another reason why Israelis very much want the operation in Rafah to happen. This idea that there are 1.5 million Palestinians who are innocent down in Rafah, the really last big southern city in Gaza that the IDF hasn't conquered yet. The idea that there are 1.5 million innocent Palestinians there. Most Israelis don't really go for that. They really go for they're much more inclined to say, well, how many innocent Palestinians are there? Not that everyone is involved with Hamas or Islamic Jihad, but the idea that regular families are housing hostages, children, Israeli children who've come back who were hostage, told about regular Gazans beating them as they were taken through the streets when they were first kidnapped. Uh, there really isn't as much separation in the mind of the Israeli between Hamas and ordinary citizens as the rest of the world might feel. I think the rest of the world feels that there is Hamas and then there are the ordinary innocent Gazans. And Israelis are much less inclined to feel that way. They are much more inclined to feel that it's blurry, that it's murky, and that the lines of demarcation aren't nearly so strong. And a lot of people have asked in this session, how do Israelis feel about the moral issues of killing, the fact that we have 30,000, or now I think the number is 31,000 uh, Gazans who have been killed so far in this war. And, Israelis are always quick to point out that, first of all, those numbers that you hear are always reported by, when you hear the Gazan Health Ministry, that is the Hamas-run health ministry. Hamas reports those numbers, so we don't know how accurate they are. That said, the IDF itself does believe that the number is around 30,000 dead in Gaza. However, what's more important is that between 13 and 14,000 of those are Hamas. So not quite 50%, but very close to 50% of those dead in Gaza are Hamas militants. And you never hear that when those numbers are reported in the New York Times or other media, or if you do, it's far down in the story that tends to get lost in the narrative. And typically in war, the United Nations has found that 90% of all deaths in war, of all casualties, are actually civilians, and only 10% are actually combatants. Here you have 40% higher, almost 50% are combatants. I think there's a very good argument to be made that the IDF, relative to how other nations fight their wars, how other armies fight their wars, that the IDF has done a very good job, even an excellent job of minimizing civilian casualties given what we are up against, which is an enemy that embeds itself among the civilian population, that dresses as civilians, that uses hospitals, ambulances as their bases of operation. We'll talk more about that a little bit more in the news section related to the big raid in the Shifa hospital in the center of Gaza this week. But given what Israel is up against, it's actually done, I think, a very good job of minimizing civilian casualties. But what I want you to realize is that this line between civilian and militant is much blurrier in the mind of the Israeli than it is for the rest of the world. We don't see that separation nearly as clearly. The third narrative I want to speak to you about relating to Sorry I Was Kidnapped and being held hostage. In a way, it seems like it's not related at all, but I think it is. And it has to do with the reason I'm in New York City right now. Some of you may know that the reason I'm in New York is because last night were the National Jewish Book Awards, and my book, Israel 201, received the National Jewish Book Award for the 2023 publishing year in the category of education and Jewish identity, which obviously is quite an honor, and my co-writer Benji and I are thrilled to have received that. There was a very serious part of this ceremony as well last night. In addition to taking the photos and getting our little awards and handshakes, etc., there was a speech by the president, who is a lay leader volunteer of the Jewish Book Council. And she spoke about what's happening in the publishing industry right now and how Israeli authors are really being stigmatized, if not outright blacklisted, in the American publishing industry. And this is very serious. And it's another way of being held hostage. Not nearly as brutal, obviously, as being held in Gaza. But I want to make you aware of some of the ripple effects and repercussions of everything happening right now. Here are some of the things that she mentioned last night. Number one, that US publishers are simply refusing to publish Israeli authors, that when they submit their book proposals and works of fiction and poetry to US publishers, they're simply not accepted. They won't even be read. Same with literary agents, that literary agents in the United States are not accepting submissions from Israeli authors. That publishers and even literary agents are refusing Israel-related content. The idea being, well, there's two reasons. One, is that they just don't want to support the Israel apartheid genocidal regime by publishing Israeli authors and Israel-related content. But the other is sort of how they would be seen, that they don't want to be seen as someone who sympathizes with Israel and sympathizes with the Israeli cause and the Israeli occupation and the war in Gaza, which statistics show now a majority of Americans are against how Israel is fighting the war in Gaza. So that's just refusing to even consider Israel-related content. A number of authors, both Israeli and sometimes just Jewish, have had their book events canceled. And related to this is that certain venues that would normally house a book event, like independent bookstores, are refusing to house book events, to host book events for Israeli authors and sometimes even Jewish authors. There are threats of big name authors or more popular authors refusing to leave their literary agents and find a new agent, or leave their publishers and find a new publisher if Israeli authors or Israel-related content is accepted by their agents and publishers. So it's authors who have sway are refusing to allow their agents and publishers to take Israeli and Jewish-related content. And there's also reports of Jews in the publishing industry feeling uncomfortable, that they feel that they either need to minimize their Judaism or just not talk about it. That what they hear around the proverbial water cooler is threatening to them and makes them feel uncomfortable. Although I must say, I also know from firsthand experience that some of the people who are most vocally, or certainly who are vocally against Israel and Israel-related topics in publishing are Jewish and Jewish themselves, and sometimes I've heard of cases where they might have Israeli parents or one Israeli parent, which makes it even more complicated for them, that they feel sort of torn and don't even want to touch it, don't want to go near that content. So this was spoken about last night, and I must say the Jewish Book Council is really trying now to make this a new arena that they are active in. They have started I'm not sure if it's a website or a web page or some sort of forum where anyone in the publishing industry can report anti-Israel sentiment or anti-Semitism that they experience. It can be as small as feeling like their book proposal or work of fiction isn't being read or is being ignored, and they have reason to suspect that there could be anti-Semitism or anti-Israel feelings behind it, or something as large as having one of their events canceled. You know, the musician Matisyahu has had several of his live events canceled, his shows canceled because of, and it's always quote, always phrased as safety concerns or safety of the performer, but that can also just be a way to hide what's really going on, is that the venue doesn't want to be associated with this artist. So the Jewish Book Council is trying to be there as a resource, both to offer advice and also work with a team of volunteer lawyers who can help those who are experiencing these kind of obstacles. But who knew that in the year 2024, in this industry, books, we pride ourselves in expressing ourselves, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And it's just so ironic that those who have dedicated their careers to the idea of the free expression of ideas are now repressing ideas and the creators who bring them to the public. So it really is hypocrisy, I feel, and really in its highest form. But that is that is a little bit of the state of the industry right now that I wanted to share with you, and which I feel is another way of that Jews and Israelis can be held hostage, that their ideas simply aren't let out into the open, and their ideas are held prisoners within themselves. So in terms of the news from this week, there really is a lot to talk about. A lot of little stories. I wouldn't say there's any one major story that blows, everything out of the water, but a lot of smaller stories which add up show you, I think, paint a very accurate picture of what's happening in Israel right now. Let's stay on the topic of hostages for a second. I've been adamant that I really don't feel a hostage deal is going to happen. I've said this week after week that whatever you're hearing in the news, it just, my gut instinct is that it's not going to happen. And we saw a little more evidence of that this week in a few ways. First of all, Israel presented what many would say is a very, very generous plan. 400 Palestinian terrorists in Israeli jails would be released for just 40 hostages, including female soldiers. So we're talking a 10-to-1 ratio. And this would be in exchange for what I believe was a 6-week ceasefire. And many thought that this was, including the United States, thought that this was a very fair and generous deal. And Hamas rejected it. But just this week, Israel came back with a second deal, which was even more generous, doubling the number they would release. So instead of 400 released, 800 Palestinian terrorists released from Israeli jails, including 100 who have committed murder. And this is something that Israel said in the past that it would not do, that it would draw the line at releasing people with the proverbial blood on their hands. But this week, Israel made an offer where they would release 800 Palestinian terrorists, among them 100 who have blood on their hands. And once again, Hamas rejected the deal. Now, in addition to that, there was a speech within I think it was in the last 48 hours by Khaled Mashal in Jordan. This is the head of the Hamas, I think, political wing, and he gave this speech and he said that there will be no hostages released until the IDF is out of Gaza. And he called their hostage negotiation war as important as the war that they initiated on October 7th. And what we're seeing is that Hamas is very savvy here. I think we should take him at his word. What they're seeing is that they don't need to do anything. By holding out and making Israel make bigger and bigger concessions and then simply refusing them, the world is not turning on Hamas. The world is not saying, come on, Hamas, Israel is offering you exactly what you want. You need to take this deal. Instead, the United Nations this week voted for a ceasefire. And it did mention in the ceasefire that part of the ceasefire would be the release of all hostages. But this United Nations resolution, first of all, it called for an absolute ceasefire, not just a pause in fighting, but an end to all fighting in Gaza, meaning that Hamas would be intact. And the other thing this United Nations resolution did not do, it did not condemn Hamas for October 7th. It did not condemn Hamas for the various sexual crimes that I spoke about before. It simply called for an end to all fighting and for the U.S. to come out, for Israel to come out of Gaza. And so what Hamas is seeing is that they can keep on saying that Israel is the one who's being difficult. Israel is the one who's ruining the deal. And the world buys it. And the United Nations certainly buys it. Now, these United Nations resolutions are not binding. Israel is not obligated to do anything differently because of them. And it's worth pointing out that the United States did not veto this resolution. It simply abstained. It's clear that the United States actually agrees with the concept of an end to the war, complete end, not just a ceasefire of 6 weeks, but a complete end to the war and the release of all hostages, but leaving Hamas intact. And what the United States has said is that we believe there are different ways to guarantee Israel's security than going into Rafah and leaving and destroying Hamas. That leaving Hamas somewhat intact would not threaten Israel in the United States' eyes, that there are other ways to guarantee Israel's security. So if you're asking me, will there be a hostage deal? I will say what I have said before. We have no reason to think that there is, because Hamas doesn't want one. And not only that, Hamas, I have told you before, benefits from Israel going into Rafah. The United States does not want Israel to go into Rafah, which is, like I said, the last big southern city in Gaza. It's on the Egyptian border. Everyone who's fled from northern and central Gaza is now in southern Gaza. So you have 1.5 million Palestinians there. The United States does not want Israel to begin an operation. But Hamas, I assure you, would be very happy for Israel to go into Rafah. because it would mean many civilian casualties. It means better optics for Hamas. They look like the victim of Israeli aggression once again. Hamas does not actually care for their civilians, the civilians in Gaza, because if they did, they would have taken one of these other hostage deals. So there's really no reason to think that there will be a hostage deal moving forward. It saddens me to say that, but I believe that is the situation. If it were any different, we would have seen movement on it until now. So we talked about this United Nations resolution calling for the immediate, complete ceasefire, the release of hostages, but not condemning Hamas. Well, that led to a lot of political upheaval in Israel. Netanyahu, when he heard this, canceled his upcoming trip. There was supposed to be a delegation sent to the United States to talk about alternatives to Rafah, an operation in Rafah, or to discuss how to do the Rafah operation as carefully as possible. Netanyahu canceled sending that delegation. The United States then pushed back and said that Netanyahu canceled before the resolution had actually passed, that it's actually Netanyahu playing politics. And then today, the most recent news is that this delegation now is back on. So apparently, Netanyahu will be sending a delegation to the United States to discuss the Rafah operation and possibly alternatives to it. But it did lead to a lot of, as we say in Israel, balagan, chaos politically. And it's also, I want to bring up those numbers I mentioned before. There is some new, I think it's the Harvard Scripps poll it's called, and there were some new numbers that came out. Still, about 80% of Americans approve of the idea of Israel over Hamas. So if you just give them A or B, Israel or Hamas, 80% believe Israel is in the right, and that Israel is in the right in destroying Hamas. However, once you start getting more specific about how that happens, the percentages go down. So only 66% of Americans believe that Israel is trying to minimize civilian casualties. I actually find that pretty high, given the amount of talk about Israeli aggression. The fact that 2/3 still believe that Israel is trying to minimize civilian casualties, I wouldn't say I'm impressed, but that number is higher than I would have thought. 63% of Americans believe there should be a ceasefire only after all hostages have been released and after Hamas has been removed from power and as a threat to Israel. 63% believe that there should be a ceasefire only after all hostages are out and that Hamas is removed. That does mean that 30%, 7% believes there should be a ceasefire before all hostages are released and Hamas is no longer a threat. That is sort of mind-boggling. You would think that anyone would say that the one condition for a full ceasefire, at minimum, release all of the hostages. The fact that 30%, 37% of Americans don't believe all hostages being set free is a condition of a full ceasefire, that to me is a little bit confounding. And finally, the number I mentioned before, 55% of Americans now disapprove of how the IDF is fighting in Gaza. So that means over half. It used to be 50%, maybe just over 50% actually supported how Israel was fighting in Gaza, but now 55% are against how Israel is fighting in Gaza. And what this tells me is that the hostage question has really just receded from people's minds. Either they've heard about it for so long, we're almost going on 6 months, that it's lost its saliency, or that simply it's overwhelmed by the images they're seeing of Gaza, the destruction in Gaza, that the pictures, the suffering is so powerful and so scintillating that Americans just want it to stop without even really caring about what would happen next or what the next plan would be. It doesn't matter if Hamas is still in power. It doesn't matter if there are still hostages. The fact that all of these, you know, innocent Gazans are dying is enough for them to want to end all uh, all of the IDF's operations in Gaza. So that is sort of what we're seeing right now in terms of American uh, opinion. Now, that said, the IDF and the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, have announced that they are going to begin the Rafah operation no matter what, and they're targeting as April or May. And this is sort of a flip-flop from what they said before. They had said before that if there were not a new hostage deal by Ramadan, which is now already, I believe, 2 weeks ago, the beginning of Ramadan, the IDF had said before that if there were no new agreement by the start of Ramadan, that they would go into Rafah during Ramadan. Now it seems that they are waiting till the end of Ramadan. They also, I think, want to make their plan as it's hard to say foolproof, but as strong as possible. But I do believe the Rafah operation is going to happen in April or May. And to be clear, most Israelis by far want this. Most Israelis want it to have happened already and believe that Netanyahu is actually being controlled too much by Biden and by the Americans. Most Israelis do not understand why we are waiting so long to go into Rafah, that we're actually giving Hamas more time to regroup. Now, in defense of the idea to sort of wait longer, I think we actually do have good reasons to wait a bit longer. And that relates to the next story I'm going to talk to you about. It's this raid at Shifa Hospital. Shifa Hospital is one of the main hospitals in Gaza. It was found before to be really the base of Hamas operations in Gaza. There was a whole underground complex with computer terminals and uh, really just a pretty much a military base underneath this hospital. And entrances to this underground complex from the hospital itself. There's no way that the doctors, nurses, and medical staff could say, we had no idea this was existing beneath us. I mean, it's just obvious. And we found even more evidence of this during the past 10 days during our raid of Shifa Hospital, that I mentioned this last week, that one of the main offices of Hamas is right next door to the office of the director of the entire hospital. There's no way that this is being done by Hamas without the hospital staff knowing. So first of all, why is this happening in the first place? If we already raided Shifa Hospital and pushed Hamas out of it and gathered a lot of intelligence, why is this other raid happening? Well, once we cleared out central Gaza and cleared out Shifa Hospital, we went on to fighting in other parts of central Gaza, Khan Yunis. We went down to fight in more southern parts of Gaza. And meanwhile, Hamas decided to regroup. And here's how we know this. We've been capturing a lot of Hamas militants. So we can't just look at the number of killed Hamas, which, as I've said, is in the 13, 14,000 range. We also have to consider the number of captured Hamas militants. It's probably over 1,000, maybe in the few thousands at this point. And we are getting a lot of valuable intelligence from these captured Hamas militants. And first of all, one of the things we learned was that Hamas decided to regroup in Shifa Hospital and to use Shifa Hospital as their base of operations once again. We got this information most likely from a very high up Hamas militant who had been captured. And the result of this is that we have captured now 500 more Hamas militants in this raid of Shifa Hospital. It was a very daring and well-planned raid. In the middle of the night, Shifa Hospital was surrounded by IDF tanks and ground troops. And this was a complete surprise to the Hamas militants inside. They were able to kill hundreds of Hamas militants in gun battles and capture at this point 500 Hamas militants who will provide more intelligence that we can use for future operations. And this is why I believe that it's good right now to wait for any operation in Rafah. The more intelligence we can get from more captured militants, the better the operation in Rafah, in Rafah will be. So that's why I think it makes sense to wait. Some of the other news that's coming out of this raid of Shifa Hospital is that Hamas has been using the maternity ward and the emergency room as bases of their military operations. So they're even destroying, they're firing at from the maternity ward and from the emergency room. But as they fire and use it as a base of military operations, they're destroying a lot of the equipment, a lot of the walls, the infrastructure. So they're actually destroying the hospital itself from the inside. So you might be asking, why is the world not reacting? Why is the world not saying anything when Hamas is actually destroying the maternity ward of its own hospital? So two things. First of all, I don't know that they're not reacting. One thing I've sort of learned by being here in the United States for this past month is that it does seem to me that the war in Gaza is not as front of mind for Americans as it had been just a month or 2 months ago. Those of us who are really passionate and who are really want to stay in the loop and be on top of everything happening in Israel and who care, it seems so important to us. But for the rest of America, this I don't think it's nearly as important as we might think it is. So that's one reason. I wouldn't say that they're not noticing. It's just not as much of a priority as we might have believed. And the other is that it could be that the feelings against Israel are so strong that really nothing, no news that comes out of Gaza could be the type of news that would actually sway opinion to the side of Israel. For those who are really anti-Israel, they see anything Hamas does as legitimate because they see them as freedom fighters who are trying to liberate an oppressed people in Palestine, and they don't draw a line between what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So it really could just be that no matter what happens, it would never actually sway public opinion. Opinion would never change toward Israel. All right. So let's go to the north real quick. I've been telling you for a while that we see a war in the north coming. Well, I still believe that. We had a few missiles, actually quite a barrage of missiles fired today at Israel. One civilian was killed in Kiryat Shmona. This is really the northernmost big city in Israel. He was a truck driver for a paper factory, and this was a factory that employed mostly people who were special needs, high level special needs employees who could function enough in a workplace. But nevertheless, most of the workers at this factory are special needs people. And, I think Israel needs to publicize this more, that this is who Hezbollah is attacking. But the driver, he was killed. This driver who was a delivery driver for this paper goods factory, who was about to be engaged soon to his girlfriend, um, was killed. And it just sort of reiterates that the war really in Israel, we do believe this war is coming. It's simply a matter of time. But our military needs are so stretched right now that I don't think we have it in us to fight on a third front. And I say a third front because, of course, there's Gaza, but there's also the West Bank. We have more soldiers in the West Bank right now and on the West Bank prepared for operations there than we do in Gaza. And we also have more soldiers in the north ready for any combat there than we do in Gaza. So, strangely enough, Gaza is actually the place of our three fronts where we have the fewest number of soldiers right now. And I think there's just a feeling that we need to strike Hezbollah when the time is right. And right now, the time is not yet right. We should talk about the Haredi draft. The ultra Orthodox has been in the news so much. Whether ultra Orthodox members of society would be drafted into the IDF. Their mantra is among the Haredi ultra Orthodox Jews, their mantra has been that we would rather die than serve in the Israeli army. That's what they've said out loud. That is their sentiment. And the the ruling party, Likud, and its coalition, Netanyahu, had until this week to submit a plan for drafting the Haredi members of society for how to do it. And they finally submitted their plan. And the plan was very much a joke. And it was immediately panned by uh, really by politicians across the spectrum. What the plan called for basically was that they would now draft ultra Orthodox soldiers, the Haredim. However, they raised the age of exemption applications to 35, meaning that you could, up until the age of 35, you could keep applying for an exemption. The idea being that you would probably be granted this exemption. So what it really, basically what it was saying is, we're going to draft you like everyone else. However, we're going to raise the age to age 35. Until we'll raise to 35 the age at which you can apply for an exemption, and we'll most likely grant that exemption, which is basically just saying we're not going to draft you, which is sort of rephrasing the current policy. And like I said, everyone came out against this. It was blasted by members of the war cabinet, Gantz and Eisenkot, by the opposition, Yair Lapid. But also Yoav Gallant, who was the defense minister, said that he is not going to support any legislation to draft the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, unless it's first been approved by Benny Gantz and Eisenkot, these members of the war cabinet who are from opposition parties. Yoav Gallant, many Israelis feel that he's one of the most trustworthy Israelis right now. He and Netanyahu, I think it's fair to say, do not get along at all. And he's basically saying, I'm not just going to put through any legislation that Netanyahu wants. I am going to make sure that the legislation represents what most of Israeli society wants, which is drafting the ultra-Orthodox into the military. But where do we stand right now? The Netanyahu government has requested an extension until March 31st to come up with a new plan for drafting the ultra-Orthodox. We will see what happens between now and then. They've had plenty of time to submit a plan until now. Now they're asking for an extension. So a week from today, we'll see what their next plan is. I want to go to some of your questions, because we had, like I said, a lot of questions this week, and I've tried to sort of organize them according to similarity. A lot of you asked similar questions, and they were really across the spectrum. And what I liked about the questions this week, they weren't just about the military or politics or what Israelis are going through. A few of them were about Israeli life in general. And that includes this first one. This first one is from David, and he asked, how was Purim? I'm wondering how Israelis are celebrating. Anything happening with active soldiers and hostages? And those issues must make it tough for families with young children who might want to enjoy Purim, but who feel that this isn't the appropriate time to celebrate it as they normally would. So, David, that's a great question. How did Israelis celebrate Purim this week? And it actually was, it was a little bit of a debate. There were those who said we should celebrate it as we normally do, because we need, especially to give our children a sense of normalcy and to communicate to them that we can still be happy and that it's still good to be Israeli and good to be Jewish, and we need to celebrate the miracles. And then there are others who said, particularly the families of hostages, who said it is completely inappropriate to celebrate at all, that we should not be celebrating Purim when there are still 130 Israelis, although 32 of them have been suspected of having already been killed. But the number is 130 hostages still in Gaza, that it would be wrong to celebrate Purim. And what ended up happening was sort of a compromise. Many cities canceled their big parade. A lot of cities in Israel have what's called a Ad Lo Yada. Ad Lo Yada comes from the expression of Ad Shelo Yodea, like until you don't know. There's this tradition on Purim that you need to drink so much that you don't know the difference between a Haman and a Mordechai. And so the parades are called Ad Lo Yada. And most cities actually canceled their Ad Lo Yada costume parades. Many schools have not just the day of Purim that you dress up, but all the days leading up to Purim. So maybe on day one, you dress up as a movie character, and day two, you dress up as an athlete, and etc. Most schools, at least my kid's school, only had one day of dress up instead of that 5 leading up to the dressing up. And there was not a costume parade as there normally was in my kid's school. But there was a parade in Jerusalem, although it was sort of a muted down version of the parade, smaller than the turnout they were hoping for or had planned for, and not as celebratory. And tomorrow, in my newsletter, which is called Hebrew is Magic, I'm assuming many of you are on it, but if you're not, I'll put the web address where you can sign up. I'll be talking about the idea of Purim and how Oznei Haman, which means Haman's ears, that expression can actually teach us a way to think about celebrating Purim during difficult times like this. It's actually a really beautiful double meaning associated with the word Ozen, which means ear, specifically related to Oznei Haman. So if you're not on the mailing list, I'll put the web address at the end where you can sign up if you want to get that letter tomorrow. So that's a question from David about how we celebrated Purim. Ellen from Schenectady wrote in to say that the Schenectady City Council tried to pass a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, and that many in the Jewish community were very outspoken against this. Many in the Muslim community were very adamant for getting this resolution passed. And she said, "What do I think about pressuring Israel for a ceasefire?" And it's very complicated. On the one hand, what I want ultimately is Israel to be safe in the long term. I would actually support some sort of plan that would I've said this before, call for a two-state solution if we had the world's buy-in. So not just two states recognizing a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and then the rest of the world not being involved, but Israel needing to secure its own borders by itself. But if we really had American involvement, some of these Arab countries, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, rebuilding Gaza and making sure that Gaza was Hamas free and that the West Bank were Hamas free. If we really had a world buy-in, and I thought Israel could be safe and that this new Palestinian state would be demilitarized, then I would support it. But most places that are calling for a ceasefire, what they want is an immediate ceasefire complete without necessarily freeing all the hostages and also without dismantling Hamas. And I, like most Israelis, do not support that. And I do believe that we need to do this operation in Rafah, not just to dismantle Hamas, but also it's clear to me that we're not going to get a hostage deal. And as I've said before, we need to signal to the rest of the Arab world that we mean business. And, Hezbollah is watching. They are learning from how we fight this war in Gaza. And the harder we go on Hamas, Hezbollah knows that we will go hard on them as well. So Barb asked a question about, and here's a question from Solomon. So Solomon wants to know about drafting the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, and he suggested that what we really need are ultra-Orthodox units in the army. And what he wrote was, obviously, these frum Jews want to live in Israel and they want to protect the Jewish state. They just don't want to be forced to give up their Torah lifestyle. And what I would counter is that I actually don't agree with that. I don't, the ultra Orthodox in Israel have always said that the reason they can't serve in the army is because the level of kashrut would not be strict enough, that they would have to be mixed with women too often, and it wouldn't respect their religious values. But the main reason they don't want to serve is that they don't want to serve. I don't think religious reasons are the reasons that's keeping them. I think they really just don't want to serve. And so I don't agree that they would only protect the Jewish state by serving in the army if only they could. I think they are just using that as an excuse to not having to serve. They don't want to give up the lifestyle they have, which is studying in yeshiva, receiving subsidies to study in yeshiva, receiving subsidies for all the children that they have, uh, without having to give back to the state. I don't think they want to be integrated into Israeli society. So I would actually push back and say that that is not actually the reason that they are not joining up. And I don't think having ultra-Orthodox battalions would necessarily be the solution. Edward wrote in to ask, is Netanyahu trying to sabotage Biden's reelection? Is Trump really better for Israel? Two questions, perhaps related. I never considered that. That is Netanyahu actually trying to sabotage Biden's election. Maybe the appropriate answer is it doesn't matter if he is trying to. In a way, that could be what he is doing. The more that Bibi Netanyahu is being a thorn in the side of everything Biden is trying to push forward, the more frustrated Biden gets, the longer the war goes on in Israel, in Gaza, the worse Biden looks because it looks like he is supporting Israeli aggression in Gaza. And so it could actually be hurting Biden, whether he's intending to or not. Now, as for that second part, is Trump really better for Israel? I adamantly believe that Trump is not better for Israel. Now, if you were to poll a lot of Israelis, a lot of Israelis would say that Trump is better for Israel because they do not like the idea that the United Nations is not vetoing resolutions calling for a ceasefire. They don't like the fact that Kamala Harris is threatening that there could be consequences if Israel moves forward with an operation in Rafah. But I personally think that Israel needs a partner that will actually help it bring peace in the region. And I think Biden would be a much better supporter and partner of that than Trump would. I think Trump would just bring more chaos, not only to the region, but to America in general. And I'm pretty adamant about against Trump coming to power again. Frankly, I'm worried about it. Everyone I talk to here says it's 50-50, but if they had to bet, they think Trump will win. I think in the end, Biden will. But as for me, what I feel, I do not feel that Trump would be better for Israel. Even though most Israelis do, I think most Israelis in this case, with all due respect, don't know what they're talking about. Here, we're going to have one final question, and we have more that clearly I'm not going to be able to get to. But this is a final question, and it comes from Judy, and it's a few. And what I like about this is that these are, like I said, about day-to-day life in Israel. They're less about the operation and the war and hostages. They're more about just what Israeli life is like. So Judy writes, on my visits to Israel, I visit cities in tourist sites, so I don't have a sense of what it's like to live out in the suburbs. Does anyone live in apartments? How common are single-family homes? Where do the typical Israeli shop if they don't live in downtown Tel Aviv or Jerusalem? So yeah, that's a great question. I live in the suburbs. You might call it the suburb. I live in Ra'anana, which is a city, but it's also kind of a suburb of Tel Aviv. We call ourselves part of the Gush Dan, the center of Israel. We live in the center. And most Israelis by far live in apartments. You do see single family homes, but they're not the type of single family home that you will see in the United States with a big front lawn and a backyard and a basketball hoop in the driveway. Even what's considered in Israel a really big and nice home still typically is a lot smaller than even an average size American home in, say, St. Louis or Kansas City. And you don't have that big lawn. I don't think I mean, maybe I've seen 5 houses in Israel that have a lawn. Now, I haven't been all over Israel to see them, but it's much less common. Um, and the houses often are attached to each other. So you'll live in a house, but it's what you might call a duplex somewhere else, or maybe not one on top of the other, but side by side with a common wall between them. And you do have standalone homes, but it is pretty rare. So most Israelis do live in apartments, and usually most small Israeli cities like Ra'anana, we have one main street. In Ra'anana, it's Achuza, and that's where all the stores are. And you have some other stores and other streets, but if you want anything, you just walk to Achuza, and you can walk from the bakery to the barber to the bank or the several banks, and everything is on that one main street. In many Israeli cities, smaller cities, are set up like that, with that one main street running through the center of town, and everything sort of growing out around it. And Judy also asked, given the geographic layout with Gaza and the West Bank separated by Israel, has anyone proposed solutions for a contiguous Palestinian state? And yes, in the past, there have been plans for a contiguous Palestinian state connecting Gaza and the West Bank. And the two options were a bridge going above ground from one to the other. But a much more popular idea was an underground sort of tunnel. I guess I hate to use the word tunnel because we associate tunnels with what's in Gaza right now. But the idea was an underground tunnel running from the West Bank to Gaza that would connect Gaza and the West Bank and make one contiguous Palestinian state. Now, I must say that that is completely off the table now, that even when Israelis talk about having a Palestinian state for our own security, and I'm in the minority of those who say that we, should act on that now. No one is saying that we should connect Gaza and the West Bank because we are seeing what happens with smuggling. We are seeing that right now, support for Hamas, as I said, is over 300%. It's grown over 300% in the West Bank. And right now, the latest poll shows that 70% of the residents of the West Bank believe that Hamas was in the right on October 7th that what they did was justified. We don't want to connect Gaza in the West Bank in that kind of scenario. So all these plans for contiguity between the West Bank and Gaza, those are off the table right now. And the final question, well, there's actually one final thing that I wanted to bring up before I close. And that there were actually two, you might have seen this in the news, two significant deaths in the Jewish-Israeli world today. One is Joe Lieberman, who ran for vice president and really was could have been the highest Jew in American elected office had a court case gone differently in Florida. That was 2000, if you all remember. But Joe Lieberman passed away today. But he's actually not the one I want to talk about. I want to talk about another death that we experienced today, which means a little bit to me personally, and that's Professor and Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, who passed away at the age of 90. And the reason Kahneman means something to me is because I featured him in one of the chapters of my book, Israel 201. I reached out to him a few times for an interview. I was not able to get a face-to-face interview, but I still wrote about him and what he contributed to Israeli society. Israel, one of the ways the Israeli military is unique is that it has it invented a very thoughtful, innovative way to interview soldiers quickly and figure out where they would best be placed in an army. You know, the IDF drafts tens of thousands of soldiers every year, 18-year-olds, and to figure out where each 18-year-old would best serve in this huge operation, this huge bureaucracy of the Israel Defense Forces is an overwhelming task when you think about it. And yet Israel came up with a way, and the person who came up with that was Daniel Kahneman back when he was a soldier in the IDF himself. And I joke in the book that whoever could actually come up with the system should deserve a Nobel Prize. And lo and behold, Kahneman did eventually win the Nobel Prize for his work on what's called social economics and actually undermining the idea that human beings are rational. You know, the underlying idea of all economics had been that ultimately human beings are rational figures who make rational decisions. But he and his partner Amos Tversky at Hebrew University proved that we are not rational. In fact, we are completely irrational. And we use heuristics, which are little clues to making decisions that actually have nothing to do with what's rationally best for us. And I've spoken before on this podcast of how I'm going to do explainer episodes. I recorded an explainer episode recently with Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove about the role of the rabbi in America. I'm having that edited right now, and that will go up soon. But over the next week, I'm going to record a short explainer episode about Daniel Kahneman and his contribution to Israeli society to help you and other listeners understand better what we lost this week today when he passed away, and also what he and Amos Tversky did, not just for Israeli society, but for the world in general. So I will let you know all of that in my newsletter when that is up and available. And I mentioned the newsletter before. That is the place to get Hebrew is Magic and get the links for this weekly webinar. And I'll put that right here. It's joelchasnoff.com/podcast. And I believe you can go ahead and just click that and it will take you directly to the site. Keep your questions coming. It's always better for me to get these by email. And in every newsletter, I have a link where you can email me your questions for future podcasts. If you sent in a question and I didn't get to it, I assure you it wasn't personal. I always do my best to get to as many as possible. Next week's broadcast will take place once again, on Tuesday night. We're going to be back to Tuesdays next week. So that's April 2nd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. For right now, thank you for joining me this week. Signing off from New York City, I'm Joel Chasnoff at Inside Israel, the Hitraot, a safe and peaceful week to all of you. And I'll leave the chat open for a few more minutes so you can hang out amongst yourselves. And I'll also unmute you so you can talk with each other if that's what you would like to do. Toda rabah. Laila tov.